writes about what it was like to build the Trans-Canyon telephone line. And this is a quote from his book. He wrote, "For a person to qualify for a job of this nature, he would need a degree in engineering, the strength of a mule, the endurance of a camel, the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, and the tenacity of a bulldog." And I think that really sums up what these men were like. They were everything that you see up there and more, because they strung more than 30 miles of phone line across the Grand Canyon in just 11 months, bringing reliable phone service, not just to Phantom Ranch, but to the North Rim as well. So the Trans-Canyon telephone line was one of the large projects that Company 818 was working on, but they also built a couple of our trails in the Inner Canyon as well. And one of those trails is the Clear Creek Trail. Now this particular trail is not one of our trails that goes from the rim down to the river. It is a 9-mile-long trail that simply goes along the Tonto Plateau, and it was built for the simple reason to open up another area of the Grand Canyon for people to be able to enjoy the beautiful panoramic views. But the second trail that Company 818 built was one that the National Park Service had wanted to see built for a very long time, because this particular trail was one that was going to help make visits to Phantom Ranch a whole lot more convenient. Now, if you had gone down to Phantom Ranch before the CCC came in 1933, you might have gone down the way many people go down today, simply down the South Kaibab Trail and then cross the Black Suspension Bridge over the Colorado River to the north side of the river where Phantom Ranch is located. However, if you had wanted to go down the Bright Angel Trail, well, you could have done that, but you couldn't have gotten to Phantom Ranch, because had you gone all the way down the Bright Angel, you would have ended up at the Colorado River, 2 miles downstream from Phantom Ranch on the wrong side of the river. So if you wanted to use the Bright Angel Trail to get to Phantom, you would have had to cut 4.5 miles across the Tonto Plateau and then intersect with the South Kaibab Trail. This was just not a very convenient way to get to Phantom Ranch. So what the Park Service wanted to do was to build a trail that would connect the Bright Angel and the South Kaibab at river level. Now, it was not until Company 818 arrived that the park had the money or the manpower to build this particular trail. Now, the trail itself is only 2 miles long, but it took the entire 3 winters that Company 818 was in the Inner Canyon to build, because this entire trail had to be completely blasted out of solid rock. There was no natural break in the rock cliff, so hundreds of thousands of tons of rock were blasted out. Hundreds of thousands more tons of rock were removed by hand. And this job was a very difficult job in the fact that they did have to use a lot of explosives, so it was a dangerous job. But in order for them to be able to set to the charges to blow up all those rocks, the men did need to drill into the very hard crystalline rock that we have at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And in order to drill into the rock, they needed to have an air compressor to run their drills. And back in those days, there were not just air compressors laying around at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, so a gasoline-powered air compressor, the one that you see here in the picture, had to be brought down from the south rim to the bottom of the canyon for this job to be done. Now, this air compressor weighed over about 1,500 pounds, so much too big to put on the back of a mule. And back then there was no helicopter technology to help us out with bringing large objects into the canyon like we do today, so the men had to bring that air compressor down the Bright Angel Trail by hand. And the way that they did it was actually quite clever because they took a little lesson from the Egyptians. You've probably all seen movies on how those big blocks of stone were moved to build the pyramids. Of course, they rolled those blocks on rollers or logs, and that's exactly what the men of Company 818 did. They set that air compressor on rollers, and then there was a mule that actually helped to pull the air compressor very slowly down the trail, but men had to stand behind the air compressor, several of them holding on to ropes to keep the air compressor from rolling over the mule. And so very slowly they would let those ropes out, and as the logs then at the back of the air compressor were exposed, one man would pick that log up and simply run in front of the air compressor, set it down, and they'd let out a little more rope. It took 2.5 days to get that air compressor to the bottom of the canyon. But once it arrived, the work then was able to commence. And again, this was a very, very dangerous job. These men were blasting out hundreds of thousands of tons of rock. They were dangling by ropes hundreds of feet up above the Colorado River. Now, of course, they did have safety equipment, but I'm sure the safety equipment that they were using back then is something that OSHA would frown on today, but it was the best safety equipment that they had for the time. And the Park Service realized that this was a very, very dangerous job. So they decided that they would hold off on naming this trail until the project was finished. And then the idea was that they simply would name this trail after the first man that died in the construction of the trail. Don't you think that was nice of the Park Service to think so far in advance? Well, I'm sure some of you already know the name of this trail. It actually has a very boring name. It is called the River Trail, and it is not named after Bob River. It's named after the Colorado River because nobody died in the construction of the trail. There was one pretty serious accident. 2 young men were hit by some falling rock, but both of those guys completely recovered from those injuries. So, yeah, the trail's got a pretty boring name today, but I think this is the best name we could have possibly named that 2-mile-long trail. So they were busy putting in a lot of things down in the Inner Canyon, and one of the things that the Company 818 did build for us was that swimming pool that I read about in that book when I was 12 years old. And this swimming pool was absolutely beautiful. It was huge. In fact, it was 72 feet long, it was 40 feet wide, and it was 19 feet deep. Now, imagine digging a hole at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, 72 feet long, 40 feet wide, and 19 feet deep. That is not an easy task because the canyon that Phantom Ranch sits in adjacent to Bright Angel Creek is a floodplain. Now, this is what Bright Angel Creek looks like most of the time, but it's not unusual to see Bright Angel Creek looking like this. It does flood on a very regular basis. So through history, some pretty big floods have deposited boulders and rocks tens of feet below the surface of the earth. So in order to build this swimming pool, the men of Company 818 had to remove hundreds of rocks and boulders from the ground. Now, they did not have bulldozers or backhoes to help them out with this job. They had picks, shovels, crowbars, wheelbarrows, and the muscles in their backs. And it took them weeks to dig this hole. But once the hole hole was completed, then they simply lined the swimming pool with concrete, took some of the rocks that they had pulled out of the ground, concreted them together to make a very natural-looking rock border around the swimming pool, and then the water for the pool was actually just diverted creek water. They built a little diversion ditch